I want to introduce Duy Hoang, who works for Vietnam Reform Party, and he presented last year. It was, at least for me, one of my favorite presentations. He luckily has the full 2 hours with all of you, so we actually have enough time for robust discussion and conversation, which he is gifted at really drawing out some of your own perspectives. And this is relevant because, as many of you know, there are several countries around the world where campaigns and movements for democratic rights, political freedoms, freedom of speech, there's really not a lot of space inside those countries to wage those movements in a safe or effective way. So that means that a lot of diaspora-based groups are playing an increasingly important role in initiating, supporting some of these civil resistance movements around the world. And Vietnam is one of the best, for lack of a better word, case studies that we can look at, and the work that Viet Thanh is doing has really been a benefit to ICNC in our learning of what role diasporas play in nonviolent struggle. So with that, hand it over to Duy.
Thanks, Aaron. Okay, so diaspora communities. So I thought maybe we'll start by throwing out a very simple question. What do you think are the advantages of diaspora movements? You've looked at the question of nonviolent resistance for the last few weeks, right? How that's applied and so forth. Now, one of the players is a diaspora community, and it varies for different countries, the size of the community, the circumstances that it came about. But in general, what do you think are the advantages of having a diaspora community? Yes, please.
Resources, like financial resources, education.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Language.
Language.
The same language.
Okay. Yes.
Freedom of movement and operation.
Okay.
Outside the country.
Outside the country, yeah.
Exact same thing.
Okay. So resources, education, language, freedom of movement outside the country. And Darren?
This may go into resources as well, but access to actors outside of the country itself that may be able to put some type of pressure on the target government.
Okay. Yes, please.
Yeah, I was going to say a network that can operate outside of the oppression of in-country.
Okay.
Yes. Access to international communities and government and
okay.
Yeah.
Like international advocacy,
yeah.
essentially. Yeah.
I think on the point of language, having the ability to talk in other languages, and maybe if it's diaspora living here in the U.S. or Western Europe, have the ability to speak English to reach more people.
Okay. So diaspora is a way for the movement inside the country to be able to speak to the outside world, basically. Yes.
The global nature of the movement.
Mm-hmm.
Just the fact that people are living in multiple locations that are a part of the movement. So because of that, there's access to more people. It's more of the same types of things that other people are doing as well.
Okay. Okay. So we've listed a number of advantages, right? And some may say diaspora movements also have some baggage. So what do we see as some of the disadvantages of a diaspora movement?
They're spread out usually, so it's hard to coalesce into a unified force.
Okay. Yes.
They're not in the actual playing field.
Okay. And so what happens when they're not in the actual playing field?
You don't have any, let's say, how would I put it out? You don't have the muscles in there. You know what I'm saying? You're somehow a little bit irrelevant when it comes to fighting the regime inside.
So that is from a capacity standpoint, that you're not there. But are there other ramifications of not being inside the country? Yes.
Disconnect from the people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was in Estonia right after its independence from the Soviet Union, and the diaspora came back, and initially it was all sweetness and light, but pretty soon fissures developed that their experience outside is not the same experience as inside, and so communication became stressed.
Yeah.
It's really difficult to keep the momentum just because the groups are separated.
Okay, it's true.
Diaspora can be a representative of a majority group
compared to the minority groups in that country.
And sometimes diasporas are represented by a minority group too, which is even a further step. Yeah.
To increase extremism and perpetuate conflict.
Okay. Yeah.
You sometimes are also seen from people inside the country as being puppets of another regime or another power that wants to change their country.
Yeah.
It can actually impede the right a flow of right kind of information. I'm thinking about Iraqi diaspora, that essentially some members misled the international community in terms of believing that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction.
That's a good example. Yeah.
There can also be class and ideological differences, such as the Cuban diaspora.
Yeah. Or sometimes the Vietnamese diaspora. Yes.
Might mobilize international support against your movement.
The diaspora mobilizes. Is there a case that you can point to?
Well, I suppose, I don't know if you would call it a diaspora movement, but like, I don't know. I mean, Al-Qaeda has a considerable number of groups, nations that have allied against it.
Yeah.
And that's largely because of its existence as a transnational group, whereas if it was just restricted to Pakistan, it would be a domestic issue.
Okay. Any other thoughts on the disadvantages of a diaspora? Well, I think they've kind of exhausted all the advantages and disadvantages. Maybe we can just go for drinks. Yeah, thank you. So I think a lot of us come in here with obviously a lot of experience and have as observers or as actual participants, and we realize a lot of the advantages and disadvantages. So what I wanted to do is talk about the Vietnamese context and some of the work we do to flesh out a lot of things that we've identified already. And I think from looking at what we do in Vietnam, you'll be able to generalize to other countries because a lot of these issues are really they involve all groups across all places. Okay, and by the way, that young lady is Angelina, my colleague from Vietnam, who is also a full-time activist in the DC area. Okay, hi, Angelina. Okay, so very quick history of Vietnam, just by way of background. In English, our name is Vietnam Reform Party. The word reform is actually a difficult translation from Vietnamese. It doesn't really capture the full idea. But the idea is the objective of the organization is to promote the reform, the modernization, the development of Vietnam. That's the highest objective, hence the name. Was formed by diaspora groups in 1982. Quick history of Vietnam is the war ended in 1975 when the Communist North took over the South, and hence that's when the Vietnamese diaspora began. Before 75, there were some students studying abroad, but no significant community. After 75, the community takes shape. And after a couple years of communication, working together, a number of groups formed a coalition and founded Vietnam. Okay, and we were able to link up with the underground opposition in Vietnam. In those days, the opposition was heavily repressed. Vietnam was essentially a very totalitarian society after 75. But there was an opposition, and we found ways to link up with them. But we faced the challenges of operating in a time of the Cold War, because in 1975 or the 80s, Vietnam was shut off from the world. You couldn't get on a plane to travel to Vietnam. A lot of our activities were based in Thailand, along the border area of Laos and Thailand and Cambodia. But there was also a war going on in Cambodia. Vietnamese troops occupied Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge was active in Cambodia. So if you wanted to go from Thailand to Vietnam, you essentially had to walk through Cambodia, which was extremely dangerous. The Soviet Union had military bases in Vietnam. So the whole environment was a lot different. And so those were some of the difficulties we had. And in 2004, we opted to go public. Public meaning from essentially an underground political movement, we presented our programs in a public ceremony. We created a website, and we started acting as a public movement. The reason why we chose that is we believe that's the best way to mobilize people on the ground. Okay, and after now 28 years of activity, we have a pretty good network inside the country and abroad. There are now about 3 million Vietnamese living outside of Vietnam, in the US, Canada, Australia, Europe, and parts of East Asia. We have chapters in all the communities where there's a lot of Vietnamese, and we have a network throughout Vietnam from north to south. Okay. And our mission simply is to overcome dictatorship, build a foundation for a sustainable democracy, demand justice and human rights for the Vietnamese people through a nonviolent struggle based on civic participation. So essentially 3 ideas here is that we want to end the current dictatorship, but from there we really want to build something that's sustainable going forward, that's is going to consolidate the gains of ending the dictatorship, and that's a democracy where people's human rights are respected. And we want to do that through a nonviolent struggle based on civic participation. You can change a regime through many ways, and we think the best way is through the involvement of the people. Okay, so that's our mission. So some of the activities we do, and this really draws on one of our strengths of having presence in the diaspora community, is getting the message out. By the way, this picture here is a shortwave radio station transmitter that we had in Southeast Asia during the 80s that broadcast to Vietnam. At the time, Vietnam was completely sealed off. Obviously, there was no internet. There was no Radio Free Asia back then, and people really didn't know what was going outside in the world. So we had a shortwave radio broadcast. It was jammed in some of the cities, but it was able to broadcast to Vietnam. And we've continued that approach using modern technology now. Our shortwave broadcast now is now an AM broadcast that's heard nightly in Vietnam. The signal is too strong to get jammed, and we use all sorts of social media to reach people in Vietnam. And
Where is your radio based?
it's heard in Vietnam. We don't disclose the location of the transmitter. Yeah, and it's broadcast 8:30 to 9 o'clock every night, sandwiched between the Radio Free Asia and the BBC. So 2 very popular radio programs. Yeah. So we use social media to get our message out. Vietnam now has about 25 million people online. And even though the government has a monopoly on all media, newspapers, TV, radio within the country, but we're finding that the internet is a de facto free media. Obviously, when you have bloggers and citizen journalists operating, you have an independent media channel, and we're finding all sorts of ways to use that. So one of the things we're doing, I think all diaspora groups are good at, is getting the message out using channels that people within the country sometimes have restrictions or limitations. Yeah, did you have a comment? I'm sorry, you did. No.
Well, I did, but I didn't raise my hand.
You did? Okay. Okay. He raised his hand.
Yeah, I was just wondering, are you just in Vietnam? Is your party just
Yeah, that's an important question. We are considered a terrorist organization inside Vietnam. There's only one political organization in Vietnam, that's the Communist Party. There's no opposition that's permitted inside the country. So all independent groups are banned in Vietnam. And because we happen to be the largest and most organized, the government calls us a terrorist organization in its propaganda. And I'll get to that later in some of the challenges of diaspora groups. So we aren't registered inside Vietnam. Yes, now you have your hand up.
I apologize if this has been asked before,
That's
but
fine.
For the restrictions that the government places on the internet, do you feel like it's as, I guess not as extreme, but as kind of developed as the Chinese government's control over their internet? Do you still feel like there are some spaces for civil society to kind of express themselves that haven't been tapped by the government?
Yeah, the Vietnamese government is trying to go the way of China, but they're not going to be able to do it because they don't have the resources. And whereas China has a lot of domestic alternatives, for instance, Baidu instead of Google, in Vietnam there isn't. So people are already used to using Google. So the government can't just shut off Google because there's no local Baidu to replace it. Same thing with social networks. The Vietnamese government tried to shut down Facebook a year ago, and recently they created what people in Vietnam call the communist Facebook, a domestic alternative. But I think it kind of missed the boat, because once these social networks have been introduced already, they have communities that use them, so it's very hard to replace them. So although the Vietnamese government is using firewalls, they're arresting bloggers, and recently there's this really worrisome is they're using hacker attacks against websites, both based inside Vietnam and Vietnamese language sites based outside of Vietnam. Like our site gets hacked in and attacked all the time by denial of service attacks. So they're trying to be like China, but frankly, I don't think they have the capacity to do that. Yes, in back.
Yeah. Is there ever any danger does anyone in the Vietnamese government attack you outside of the country? Or, is there any danger of your activities outside the country? Interference?
Yeah. In places like the U.S., probably not. But in places like Cambodia and Thailand, there are activists who have been kidnapped. And there's some cases recently of religious refugees being kidnapped by the Vietnamese security services. And then they're brought back to Vietnam. You'll hear about them for a year or two, and then they're brought to trial or something like that. Yeah, that's happened. Yeah.
Excuse my ignorance, but why do we not hear this much about the oppression in Vietnam in the media nowadays, or the last years? I mean, as you put it out, it must be a very severe repression there.
Yeah.
And my perception was that Vietnam opened up a little bit for, some economical, stuff and also freedom, but it's probably wrong, right?
Well, that's a good observation. I mean, that means people in the diaspora aren't doing their jobs that well. I think there are a couple things that counter us, that are challenging us, frankly. I think is that in the West, there's a sympathy to so-called liberation movements and people's movements, which to us are communist dictatorships. And I think for the 80s and 90s, there was a little bit of a lingering feeling on that. And so that kind of puts Vietnam in a good light, meaning the Vietnamese Communist Party. And I think that applied for China until Tiananmen. I think after Tiananmen, there was no more sympathizers to the Chinese Communist Party, whereas before '89, you may have had a lot of Maoists. So that's a historical issue. More recently, I think it's the opening up of the country, and frankly, Vietnam is a beautiful country with great climate, really good food, okay? And you can go to Vietnam and have a great time as an expat, as a backpacker. So, and if you're not a political dissident, there's no issues. So I think that is something that's a challenge as well. And a lot of people know Vietnam as a destination spot. But I would say, at least in the last couple of years, through NGOs, not necessarily Vietnamese ones, but international NGOs, the human rights abuses in Vietnam do get out. They may not get out on popular media all the time, although the Washington Post occasionally has an article, the New York Times does. But within the human rights community, it's recognized that Vietnam is an issue, especially on internet freedom. I would say Vietnam is among the top three countries that people pay attention to: China, Vietnam, then maybe one of the Middle Eastern countries. So we wanted to get the story of Vietnam out, but yeah, there are some challenges.
Have you organized any major event, non-violent event in Vietnam, and you see yourself succeeding? Because I don't know whether you have a figurehead, the way you look at Mahatma Gandhi.
Yeah.
Somebody could look at, and somebody who could be a symbol of and somebody who you think is champion, of course, lead Vietnam, not just outside Vietnam.
Yeah.
Do you have such a person?
Vietnam has some well-known, two Vietnamese democracy activists, but no one near the stature of Aung San Suu Kyi or Mahatma Gandhi. So, I mean, that's just the way the situation is in Vietnam. I don't see that changing in the near future. There maybe some activists will, break through and have that stature. At least in the near future, there isn't. Your other question was, have we organized activities on the ground?
Major events in Vietnam, non-violent.
A what?
A non-violent event.
Yes, we have. I'll get back to that in a second. Okay. Sarah, yeah.
I was just going to ask, what's your messaging, how it's broken down in terms of, like, I don't know, popular entertainment versus, like, political?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what model do you follow, like, Voice of America model?
Well, I mean, for instance, let's take our radio program. We've decided that we're not going to compete with Voice of America and BBC as a pure news source, because if people want news, they're not going to come to us. Okay, but what we will do is have more of an edgy reporting, reporting on, for instance, protests, because there were some labor strikes in Vietnam, land protests. We'll talk about protests. We'll share techniques on mobilization, talk about circumvention techniques. So more of an edgy thing than just reporting the news, because that's not really our comparative advantage, and people frankly won't come to us just for pure news. Yeah. Yes, please.
Have you found that your support is stronger in one part of the country than it is in another?
That's a good question. We have found that our support is pretty, although our founding generation are people who came from the South,
Mm-hmm.
okay, but of the people who came from the South, a lot of them were northern transplants.
Mm-hmm.
If you know the history of Vietnam, Vietnam was partitioned in 1954 when the French were ejected from Vietnam, and 1 million people from the north went south, versus my family's from the north. Mm-hmm. But politically, they're all from South Vietnam. And what we've been able to rise above from the very beginning is not to see ourselves, and this is actually important for diasporas, not to see ourselves as an organization of South Vietnamese, politically. So we don't think of ourselves as people who politically belong to the South of the 17th parallel, but it's also throughout the whole country. Although Vietnam is not a particularly sectarian country, there have been conflicts between Buddhists and Catholics in the past. We don't think of ourselves as either a Catholic party or a Buddhist party. Okay, a lot of diaspora groups, Vietnamese diaspora groups, their leadership are former military officers from the South. Okay, although we have military veterans in our organization, maybe less so now because of time, but we don't think of ourselves as founded by former South Vietnamese military officers. We've really tried to have an image that represents the whole country, and that's something we're very cognizant of, and I think we've pretty much succeeded that in terms of our membership. Mm-hmm. So get back to your question in terms of do we find support? I think our message works in both places, and sometimes I find that the opposition in Vietnam is stronger, frankly, in the Hanoi area in the north, because a lot of the people have affiliations with the Communist Party, so they're less scared. People in the South may have been more repressed, but they're also scared.
So, I just wonder if immigration from Vietnam has declined during the past 10 years as it was during the 90s and 80s.
Yeah, it's pretty much slowed now. Whereas after 1975 was the boat people until the 1990s, and then the 90s was basically family reunification. The people who go out now are people actually, they're not political refugees. They're people in Vietnam who come out to work, and a lot of them stay because they get better jobs here. So they become normal, quote unquote, migrants that you have between a lot of countries. And they're not as politicized or anti-regime as the people of the generation that left after 1975. And that's actually creating issues in certain places. Like in the US, it's not an issue, but places like where there's, in Europe, in Vietnamese communities, and say in Germany, that's a problem, because you have Vietnamese who still feel associated with the regime, the current regime, and those who are more against it. Yeah. It's one of those things where I find that, for instance, you take an American, I found that a lot, for instance, among my friends who particularly did not like George Bush inside the US. But you go to Europe and you hear someone criticizing George Bush, it annoys you. And I think some of that happens among people in Vietnam who don't necessarily like the regime, but they go to Germany or France to work, and there's other Vietnamese who they see as associated with old regimes criticizing the current government, and then there's a natural reaction for that.
And is there not any reconciliation policy that these diaspora group can travel back and forth again, or they're totally banned from going back?
Vietnam now that it's opened up, basically anyone can travel to Vietnam. In my previous life as a banker, I went to Vietnam 3 times. I was also active in Vietnam, but I went to Vietnam before. So everybody can travel to Vietnam unless you're on the blacklist, which applies to some people.
Even though you were active before, or you
I wasn't as visibly active before. Yeah. Now I would be denied a visa. Yes.
With immigration declining and the kids of the first generation growing up here in the U.S., I'm sure there's less and less interest in what's happening in Vietnam, especially in a dictatorship. Are you doing something to sustain kind of the interest of these young people? Because I found that if you grow up here, I mean, going to elementary, middle, high school, you basically become American. It doesn't matter what's your background, what's your parents say. So do you have special programs to kind of motivate this young generation?
Okay. So here are actually 2 very important parking lot issues we'll get back to, okay? Our actions on the ground and the next generation. So I want to just kind of show our activities and then we'll get back to that. Okay, so we'll yeah.
Question about the Reddit. Are you streaming that video on the internet as well?
Yeah, we have a webcast. And we'll have an iPhone app pretty soon. Yeah. And I feel that, maybe the number of listeners that we have to this radio is not a lot. It's hard to measure, but I have a feeling it's not a lot. But I feel something that's sort of like the CNN effect, whereas under normal times people aren't tuning in, but when you're there and there's an emergency, then people will tune in. So I feel like when we start organizing mass protests, the fact that then people will start to tune in and we will have the infrastructure ready. So there's a lot of value of having it already there. So that's one type of activity, okay? The second activity that we're very involved in is training and capacity building. People within the country, obviously they understand the circumstances much better than we do. They have the local information, but frankly, they lack the bigger picture, and they don't know, for instance, what groups in Iran have done, or even the monks in Burma or in Eastern Europe. So one of the things that we're actively doing is training. So for instance, this is From Dictatorship to Democracy, Gene Sharp's book, which we translated into Vietnamese, and we've distributed, we have it online, and we've distributed thousands of copies inside Vietnam already. Okay, and we've translated, all the videos that you've seen, the ICNC video, like Force More Powerful, the Overthrowing a Dictator, what's it called? Bringing Down a Dictator. We've translated that, and some other documents, and we've organized a lot of training sessions outside of Vietnam, within Southeast Asia, and within Vietnam. And the ones in Vietnam, we've done it through physical training in Vietnam, or through, and then we've done online through webcasts. So we found every single which way to do the trainings. And occasionally, people who attend our trainings get arrested. So last summer, probably the most well-known lawyer in Vietnam got arrested. And he was a very successful commercial lawyer. Was a Fulbright scholar in the U.S., opened the White and Case office in Vietnam, and he was the only Vietnamese lawyer to ever win a trade case in the U.S., a catfish dumping case. Then he started becoming a pro bono human rights lawyer, and he attended our training in Thailand. And actually, these were his handwritten notes, and this picture was actually run on a government newspaper after they arrested him. And one of the reasons why he's in jail now is for attending this training. And the government hasn't gotten around to understanding how funny it sounds, but they'll talk about he attended trainings of the terrorist organization Viet Thanh on nonviolent struggle. And so they do that. We don't point that out to them, but they keep on doing stuff like that. Yeah. Yes, please.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier about there are other diaspora groups. Are there other ones that are not nonviolent, and how do you deal with them, and does that confuse people within Vietnam?
Yeah. There are no violent diaspora groups now. Maybe a couple years after 75, there were groups, for instance, that believed in armed strategy. Not that they actually implemented, at least they subscribed to one. Now there isn't. But what the government does is they try to create the perception of like one or two of these violent groups, and try to tar us with this group. That they do.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about that lawyer. Are you providing any assistance to his family, or are you in touch somehow with him?
Yeah. Well, one of the things we do is we do a lot to support activists who are being arrested. This is what actually Diasporas is very good at, supporting their families. In his case, he's actually pretty wealthy, but other families aren't. So finding ways to support their families, hiring a lawyer for them, and doing a lot of advocacy. Yeah. So a lot of the big human rights groups, like Human Rights Watch, has a program for writers in prison. So every year we nominate a couple of Vietnamese, and nowadays every year there's like 5 or 6 Vietnamese who get this award, and most of them are nominated by us. And we do similar with other human rights groups as well. And I find that this is actually quite important because a lot of activists, they want to do something, but they don't know how. And in these trainings, it's really almost like a light bulb moment for them when they see that they can affect change. It's really the power of the people. We have the ability to withdraw the consent. It helps a lot, and it gives them the self-confidence to operate.
Is that lawyer not angry at you for that workshop?
Well, he attended it voluntarily. I think he's probably angry about being arrested more than being for attending this. But I don't know. He's in jail.
How long?
6 years. So, any other thoughts on the training aspect? I think this is what Diaspora Group's pretty good at. Yeah.
After you have the trainings and capacity buildings inside Vietnam, is there any follow-through or follow-up to see what they've been able to translate some of what they learned to action?
Yeah. This is one of the follow-through. We help organize grassroots events in Vietnam. So there are a lot of farmers in Vietnam who have lost their land to development or have been promised compensation and never got compensation. Okay, and so we've helped mobilize this grassroots pressure. A couple summers ago, we organized the first multi-day protest in Vietnam. Lasted 27 days, and at the high point, 2,000 people did a sit-in, and we helped facilitate people from the provinces to come into central Saigon in front of a government building to protest. So, and so we helped with the organizational, the coordination. Sometimes when you have sort of like a safe haven out here, it's easy to coordinate. And frankly, it costs money to support this. It costs about $1 a person a day in terms of food and shelter. And that is implementing in this. And then off the record, some of the on-the-ground activists who organize these events are people who have attended trainings and are familiar with the tactics.
You said one of the things that they did in the protest was go to a government facility?
Yeah, they went outside the National Assembly offices in Saigon and did a sit-in.
How was that appreciated?
Well, what the government did was they it's a small victory in that they told the people that if they go home to the provinces, we'll address your concerns. Okay. They haven't really addressed it, but they actually acknowledged the fact that they have to address it. And then they kind of like semi-physically dispersed the people. But I think it was an accomplishment, the fact that they were there for 27 days, and the government had to begin acknowledging their claims. Interestingly, is most of these people are older women. Yeah, in some of these farmer protests. And some of them essentially have nothing to lose, and they'll just chew out the young police officers. And when you're like this older woman, and there's a young kid, 20, 25-year-old police officer, you have this like moral authority, and they can't do anything. Now if it was like some 30-year-old guy challenging them, it'll be like some kind of physical confrontation.
Actually, that gets to a point in terms of the context in which you're operating and the people you choose to use to do the grassroots pressure. I think it was last week, we were seeing videos, or 2 weeks ago maybe, videos about this group in southern Mexico that was a bunch of women who went out and conducted a nonviolent movement. And in Vietnam, with the sort of the age authority provided, I mean, have you structured your protest specifically to have women dealing with the young kid with security guards, or was that just sort of a happenstance?
Yeah, I mean, we are very aware of what types of participants have the most impact. So, you know, if we do a public event, and we've done 2 large events I'll get to this year, it so happens that the spokesman at the event that we did in Hanoi was a woman. And her background is she's a social worker. Okay, so yeah. Yes?
I've got 2 questions. One is selfishly related to ICNC, but you said that you show the documentary Force More Powerful.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if in the trainings there are any segments or cases from that documentary that appeal to people more than others, you know, that really speak to people that's related to the case in Vietnam. That's my first question. The second question is, of all the resources that you use, whether they be videos or text or what have you, which do you think in the trainings have been the most useful?
Okay. And Gina, maybe you want to answer that. And when people watch A Force More Powerful?
Yeah.
Nashville?
Yeah, Nashville. Definitely, that's the one that, I mean, that's the most popular segment of the video. I would say people, it really appeals to people.
Yeah.
The discipline.
Yeah.
Yeah, the training, all that. Yeah. And I also found that videos are actually the most like effective means for people to understand what it is about.
And are there, when you show the Nashville clip, or are there, like, how do you engage the workshop participants with that segment? Are there specific things that you want them to look for, or specific questions that you have them think about as they watch them?
Well, what we do is, well, first of all, I think a lot of people come to us because they've read the translation of From Dictatorship to Democracy, because that's rarely available. And then when we have trainings, videos are a great way to present an idea and elicit discussion. So we wouldn't show the whole video because it's kind of long, but we show like a segment and then have discussion. And then a lot of people are frankly, surprised that these things happen, or they feel inspired, or they could say that the discipline, the planning.
Yeah, planning, discipline. And also for the younger people, I would say the Serbian experience is also a big inspiration to them.
But what keeps the government not to go out and arrest this woman?
Good question.
If it's repressive government, I mean, is it now less repressive? I mean, because it definitely can do it if it doesn't like.
Yeah. Among the protesters are a lot of people that used to be somehow affiliated with the Communist Party. And then if they arrest all these people, what would they justify? How do they explain that? I think there are sort of like lines in the sand in Vietnam that you can't cross. If you organize a pro-democracy political party and you organize a lot of people, that's a line. But there's other things that don't cross that line. And so what we've tried to do is get as close to that line as possible, and sometimes move it a little bit in having events that are hard for the government to repress. So I'll give you an example. One of the big issues in Vietnam right now is territorial disputes with China. Okay, Vietnam and China have had a very difficult history, and there's islands in the South China Sea that are claimed by both Vietnam and China. The difference between those islands and, say, islands that are claimed between Japan and China is in China, the Chinese people and the Chinese government are aligned. Whereas in Vietnam, there's a long history of the Communist Party being complicit with the Chinese in terms of handing over these territories for Chinese political support. So for instance, during the war years, the Vietnamese Communist Party would always call the South puppets of the Americans. But they actually got a lot of support from China and the Soviet Union, which they traded away Vietnamese interests, which at that time was not as well known. But now it's recognized among the Vietnamese people. So almost one of the original sins of the Vietnamese Communist Party is relying on China for political support and acquiescing in Chinese land grabs. So people in Vietnam now are asserting claims over Vietnamese sovereignty. But when they do that, they're actually sending two messages. One is a territorial message, and one is an implicit criticism of the Vietnamese government. Okay, so in October, we organized a demonstration in central Hanoi, where we unfurled a banner and we read out a statement talked about Vietnamese territorial sovereignty. And we passed out T-shirts and hats that showed the map of Vietnam with the islands that Vietnamese believe that's theirs, but some of them are occupied by China. And so how does the government repress that? I mean, at most it's public disturbance. You were there without a permit. Can you actually arrest people for saying these islands belong to Vietnam, which is also the official position of the Vietnamese government?
Well, if the government is repressive, it will arrest.
Yeah, but it's repressive, but then still have to figure out ways to justify it. So at that event, we gathered a couple hundred people, and our spokeswoman at the event was a Vietnamese Australian, so a member of the diaspora. Although we had local members there, but we chose a diaspora person to be the spokesperson, frankly, because it's safer for her to do that. So she gave interviews with the wire service reporters that we gave a heads up and were at the event. And her picture was all over the international newspapers. The next day, as she was on a plane to leave Vietnam, she was arrested. And the government held her for 10 days and on investigation of terrorism. And the spokeswoman of the foreign ministry confirmed that she was being held for terrorism. But she organized this peaceful demonstration, and the media covered it. And it was really difficult for the government. And it was in all Australian newspapers. The Australian government made a fuss. And after 10 days, the government had to release her. And I think they lost a lot of face, and they actually publicized our event more by arresting her in the first place. So yes, they can arrest these people, but can they really get away with it? And then after they released her, they tried to spin it further by having an article in state media criticizing her. And what that article did is it took a picture of that event, but it cut off the crowd, so it just had her, and it photoshopped her hat and her T-shirt. Whereas her hat had a picture of the Vietnamese map, we erased it, so then she just had a blank blue hat. So the blogger said, does this mean now that the Vietnamese police are repudiating Vietnamese claims over these islands? Because that's the Vietnamese position. And the Vietnamese government erased that map. So that, again, is a public relations setback for the government. The challenge is getting these messages out. So, these regimes don't operate in a vacuum. They have to deal with public opinion. And if you can structure these events right, if you can get your message out, you can win tactically or at all these little events. Yeah.
Yeah, we were in Vietnam over the summertime, and you're right that to an outsider it seems very open in many senses, very bustling, a lot of commerce going on. Is that a problem with? It is becoming more open for people even inside, that it's hard to generate enough outrage to create a large enough movement to change a whole government?
Personally, my view is that I would rather see Vietnamese doing well than doing bad. I don't want a famine in North Korea as the reason for people to rise up. So I think I would rather have people doing well using internet, and the government shuts down Facebook, and you have 1 million teenagers pissed off about that and rising up, as opposed to people starving. And I think based on the type of change we want, where you want to build a civil society, you need people who are doing a little bit better. I frankly think proletarian revolutions happen when people are hungry and uninformed and isolated. But if you want more of a middle-class democratic revolution, it helps to have people informed. Now, in my trips to Vietnam, I tried to speak with people throughout the country. My cousins in the South who are dispossessed, my cousins in the North who have very high memberships in the Communist Party, taxi cab drivers. And what I found is, if you talk to people across the board, everyone says their life is better now than 20 years ago. In 1987, Vietnam had to import rice. That's how much the government screwed up the economy, right? So life is much better. But if you scratch the low surface, people will have some kind of discontent. And that discontent is what? They feel that there's inequities, injustices, they feel corruption. Everybody sees corruption. They feel, even people within the regime, They feel that higher officials are cheating them. So everyone is discontent. If you ask them, then what are you going to do about it? Or how are things going to get better? No one has a clue. And usually what they hope is, well, maybe the reforms will become stronger reforms. Or there'll be younger generation leaders. There's always this mythical hope of younger generation leaders everywhere that will be more progressive, but they have no clue. And that's where, democracy moves come in, is you have to show an alternative and show the means of changing the status quo. So I think, to me, the fact that living standards are better in Vietnam is not something that I consider a setback, especially if you think about what your ultimate goal is. If your ultimate goal is to improve the lives of the people, then I think it's fine if your people are doing okay. All right, another core activity is international advocacy, and I think this is one of the fortes of diaspora movements. Our members in Australia, testifying from the Australian Parliament, a Norwegian parliamentarian at a trip to Vietnam, meeting families of detained Vietnam members to show solidarity. A letter from International PEN protesting the arrest of a writer. And this is something that we do a lot, and other diaspora groups do a lot, in mobilizing international opinion. And I think for people who pay attention to Vietnam politically, the image of the Vietnamese government is a government that represses human rights. And I think the reason why that viewpoint is really ingrained is through international advocacy that you have to sustain over many years. Yeah.
Is there a preference between like the EU or UN or US bilateral relationships?
Preference between?
Like, would you approach the EU Parliament before you would approach the UN?
Yeah, I think some governments are more effective than others. I think some international institutions are basically useless. And obviously the U.S. has a huge weight in Vietnam. Then Australia, Canada, and then the EU. Some of the Scandinavian countries actually have some influence as well. Yeah. Yes.
Are you planning to work with ASEAN at all, considering that they're setting up a human rights mechanism?
Yeah, that's something we want to explore further too. And Vietnam was the chair of ASEAN this year to hold their feet to the fire. The problem with ASEAN is that that body, that secretariat, is kind of weak. So it's really just the 10 members. The 10 members kind of look after each other. So it's going to be difficult working with ASEAN, but that's something we want to use that Human Rights Commission. Right. Another thing is, I call it here IT support, but the internet is obviously a really significant force, but governments like Vietnam's are always trying to firewall it. So what we do is find circumvention methods, publicize circumvention methods. So we just came out with a blog called No Firewall. And what this blog does is it has techniques on circumvention and computer security. So we've taken well-known, respected documents by leading tech groups in the US and everywhere else and translated it into Vietnamese and made it available to Vietnamese users. And then when the Vietnamese government sends out malware, we have little alerts for people to know, okay? And this helps get out knowledge for circumvention. And we study a lot, we talk a lot about nonviolent struggle, and I think actually circumvention is sort of the starter drug for nonviolent struggle for civil disobedience. Because when someone is forbidden by the government to, for instance, access Facebook, but then they change their DNS number to get to Facebook, that's civil disobedience, okay? And it's a type of civil disobedience that I think works because it's aligned with their own interests. They're doing it because it benefits them. Other forms of civil disobedience, you're doing it because of your conscience, your belief. That's from a second stage civil disobedience, okay? This one is actually something that really is self-serving, and it's very easy to do. But when you do that, and then you show your friends how to change their DNS servers, DNS numbers, then you are really doing very subversive things. And so one of our big initiatives is promoting a circumvention movement in Vietnam, because we think that it's important to have a free internet for obvious reasons, but also get people used to defying ridiculous government rules and laws. Yeah. Yes.
I'm just wondering whether you might not be overemphasizing the importance of circumventing those measures, because they may have, I don't know, wanted to visit the websites that are not related to political struggle, that are forbidden. I don't know, maybe a kind of porno website, blog, and you provide the tools for them to do that. So how do you make them actually to even monitor, that that's circumvention that you are offering to them that leads to certain political action and has political purpose behind it?
Well, first of all, we think it's important for Vietnamese to have access to the web, okay? And the sites that are firewalled are the political sites, okay? Generally the political sites. And then second is people who start doing the circumvention will start working with us, and they can be allies in taking on larger projects. So yes, I think it's actually a huge plus to get people. I mean, I don't know if that addresses what you were, yeah.
I think people who want to watch porn, I mean, they find ways to watch it without it. Because when I was in Uzbekistan, I found this, how they call it, special websites where I can enter to other websites without showing which.
Yeah.
And that was helping a lot. And I was telling all of my friends, and because that's the place where we could get the real situation in the country. And I know I never thought about using this for something not, unless finding the information that I want.
Well, I mean, we're not going to make any moral judgments on porn here, but but the Vietnamese government says the reason why they have internet restrictions is to protect social mores and values, right? And that support pedophiles and so forth. But until one arrest about a couple of weeks ago, and this kind of messes up my story now, but before a couple of weeks ago, there was never a pornographer arrested in Vietnam. It's only political dissidents. So even though the Vietnamese government will always tell the international community, we do this to protect Vietnamese society, no pornographer until a couple of weeks ago was ever arrested in Vietnam. It's only political dissidents. So, and Vietnam, it's not like Taliban, Afghanistan, where the government is shutting down these sites. It's only the political sites. So for us, it's only a positive thing. Now, parenthetically, a friend of mine, Ethan Zuckerman, is a internet guru at the Berkman Center at Harvard, and he's really active on circumvention methods. And he says, actually, in the case of China, he wishes the government went through with the Green Dam, because you cannot underestimate the power of porn. Because if the government had Green Dam on people's computers, you would have a whole generation of 18-year-old Chinese boys, or 16-year-old Chinese boys figuring out ways to access porn. And that would be extremely subversive. They would have a whole generation of hackers, of people learning circumvention in China. So, we've seen how, porn has helped, VHS, cable, now internet. I think this is Ethan's idea in terms of internet restrictions. It has a power too. But anyways, that's an aside. Okay. Question. Do you think this is helpful or non-helpful for the movement?
What is this?
What is it?
Is it the Oval Office?
So this is our chairman, Diem Do, with other Vietnamese activists, meeting with Nancy Pelosi and Congresswoman Laura Sanchez. And that's our chairman, Diem Do, meeting with George Bush and Dick Cheney.
Helpful for whom? For you guys, or
helpful for the movement?
For the movement.
I think it is. I think it is very helpful. If you compare the activities of the Armenian-American Friendship Committee, it is very active here. And I was kind of observing it from outside for a number of years, actually. Senator Bob Dole was the patron-in-chief of the committee, and everything that happened in the Senate and the Congress had the imprint of Senator Dole. And in fact, I wanted to ask you a question. Who is your patron in the Congress? You know, either in the Senate or the House of Representatives. And related to that question also, I have a question starting with the Paris Peace Agreement.
Yeah.
In what way is it supporting or distracting you from your work?
Okay.
Peace Agreement.
Paris Peace Agreement.
Yeah. That was signed by Kissinger and your foreign minister. That brought about the end to the war.
Yeah. So that's
And
basically
that came here.
yeah. I mean that's kind of like a historical situation now.
Clauses of the treaty.
Yeah.
Does that in any way?
No, that
Okay.
yeah, that's like, but the patron question is interesting. Should a diaspora movement have a patron? And if it does, should they acknowledge that it has a patron? Yes.
Probably the question is whether it was before invasion of Iraq or after.
Okay. This was taken in 2007.
I think
Yes.
it depends on the public opinion in
Okay.
Vietnam, how they see
Yeah.
the opposition outside and how they see the U.S. And the second one depends on the Vietnamese-American relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Because in our case, Syria, we attend the same meeting, and
Okay.
it has very bad example.
Okay.
Because of all the George Bush stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Anybody? Jared?
I would just say, building off what Bhagwan was saying, that, yeah, I mean, if the government has a positive relationship with Nancy Pelosi, George Bush, or whatever government head you may be meeting with, it is helpful because it would be very hard for them to say, you know, look at this diaspora group, they're just puppets of this imperialist power or whatever. So it would force them to change their script, and it may not be a script that they want to change because they want good relations with that government or with that leader. Versus if meeting with these heads of state or parliamentarians feeds into their narrative that you're a puppet, and this is a message that really appeals to a large segment of the population inside the country, then not helpful.
Okay.
And the question if it was useful to name an advocate in the Senate or House, I would say no, because it could possibly alienate some of their constituents and lead to their failure, and they wouldn't be reelected. So, I mean, depending on where they're from and how their local population would take to that, it could hurt them, and then in turn, you don't have an advocate.
In similar meetings with my country officials every time, doesn't matter, activists, because we don't have activists, but the government officials of this country and government officials of my country, there's usually at least one prisoner of conscience is released from the prison. And I think that's a huge improvement. I mean, this government is pressing my government. There's always some kind of movement. They release someone, or they just cut someone's years from imprisonment.
Yeah. Yes.
I would say it's positive. I just think you have to know how to leverage it. Like, I'm thinking of Egypt, and I've worked closely with Saudi Ibrahim, who ended up being exiled, the Egyptian activist who ended up being exiled after meeting with Bush and Cheney around the same time. But I think ultimately, like, if you're a smart movement, you'll divide, your forces or your added value, because in Assad's case, being in Washington and being able to use those connections to the advantage of the opposition in Egypt, even though he lost credibility in Egypt and he lost public opinion in Egypt, ultimately you still have a positive effect, and that, like, the American administration in Europe is gaining kind of expertise from someone that they perceive as having moral authority, and then the Egyptian opposition within Egypt can go about their, activities, and ultimately there's a positive.
I think the question which we should ask you, that's how that these pictures affected the opposition outside, because this one will create more split inside the opposition, outside and inside, taking in our consideration the huge relationship, bad relationship between the U.S. and Vietnam.
Yeah. Yes.
Actually, I think that this idea, Ibrahim example, suggests that the meeting was made beneficial in long term, but publicizing that meeting was actually harmful for him and for the movement. So in other words, it was useful for him to probably meet with the administration, but not to have a picture out there in the press to show that. So he would still have the support of the administration, financial or whatever he was looking for by being in Washington, D.C., without the adverse effects that you just described.
Sometimes the support is the picture.
Mm-hmm.
Well, but I understand that picture or that publication of that meeting was actually harmful, right?
I mean, it depends how you define as harmful. I would say it was positive overall. It was negative for him as a person, but he knew that, he made an informed decision. But I think that having really close ties with the U.S. administration, there are objective positives to that. Whether it's publicized or not, I just think it's about knowing, again, what the added value is between, he isn't looking for popularity inside Egypt. And yet, those ties, just in, what I know personally, it's led to the release of most Egyptian activists that would renounce him publicly, but, I've been in meetings that they were literally a direct result of his interference.
So probably my question would be whether he would achieve the same thing by having those ties not publicized.
I don't think he would, because I think the American administration respects that he's one of the few that's been public. I think there's a reason why he's able to get meetings that Radwan, you can disagree with me, but why he's able to get meetings that other Arab dissidents are not. It's because he's never put conditions. He's never said, you can't talk about this, you can't publish this, you can't write this, you can't, see what I mean? So I think there is a value to being open. Even, obviously as an individual, he's paid a price, but I think the cause overall, and the irony is that the very people that he supports would renounce him. So that's kind of the irony, but if you're smart, you can use both.
Okay, interesting, yeah?
If this was members of the diaspora meeting with
Yeah, those are all diaspora people.
I feel like it would be possible to run the risk of kind of losing some of the connection with the movement actually in Vietnam. I don't know how connected the diaspora is currently to the situation, or everyone is, but I feel like if I wanted to put myself in the position of a Vietnamese activist that was on the ground, kind of putting myself at risk, and participating in activities that could be harmful to my livelihood and my life, it might be difficult for me in certain situations to see members of the diaspora that are supposed to be representing me meeting with high-level officials.
Okay. So I think from what people have brought up here, there's several issues, several considerations here. Okay. I think the first one is how that country, in this case Vietnam, views the United States. If the people on the street in Vietnam were very anti-United States, nobody wants to be a puppet of the United States. You have to run the risk of potentially a puppet in the United States, right? But if the people on the street in Vietnam is pro-U.S., then this is not necessarily a bad thing. Okay. And in the case of Vietnam, everybody in Vietnam has a cousin in Southern California. Everybody in Vietnam wants to send their kids to study in the U.S. Vietnam probably has one of the most pro-U.S. populations around the world. Okay. It's not the case of some countries in the Mideast where it's a little bit complicated. It's pretty much pro-U.S. in terms of the outlook in the
with all
country.
The history?
Pardon?
With all the history of...
Yeah.
It's
It's
a pragmatic country.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a very a country that really has, I think, a good view of the U.S. the people. The Vietnamese government is very ambivalent about the United States. On one hand, it seeks out relations with the U.S. because of economics, because of security, counterbalancing China, but it's also afraid of peaceful evolution. That said, when it sees its opposition on good terms with U.S. political leaders, that worries the government, and it gives more leverage to the opposition. So I think one level consideration is how your country, your people view, in this case, the United States. And in the case of Vietnam, it's unambiguous that it's a positive thing to have U.S. political support. Okay, so I think that's one level. The second level is within the U.S. Obviously, there are two political parties, and I as someone who's active in advocacy, I don't think it's a good idea of us being the loyal or pawns of one political party or the other one. I think if you want to get something done, you need to have bipartisan support or be equally partisan. And we see in the U.S. how domestic groups that have the support of both parties are able to advance their agenda, and domestic groups that are perceived to be, part of just one political party tend to get taken advantage of or taken for granted. Okay, so here we have, within a couple of months, within actually a month, meetings with leaders of both political parties. So we don't have the risk of being over-reliant on the Republicans or reliant on the Democrats. Another issue, and when you mentioned Iraq, last year's class was, I think, a lot more anti-Bush than this year's class, because last year's class kind of was aghast when they saw this picture. But that's just because of, the political views that we may have in this room or within Washington. But to a Vietnamese person, this is a picture with the American president. This is a picture with the Speaker of the House of Representatives. This is not a picture with this liberal from San Francisco who's, pro-gays or whatever, or with this, crazy person who started the war in Iraq. This is the U.S. president. It's the U.S. Speaker. So some of the perceptions that we may have in the U.S. About some of these political leaders don't really affect the view in Vietnam. So for us, this was, a very positive thing to have these meetings, because it reinforced our political support within the U.S. It showed people in Vietnam that this movement, this cause, is getting international attention. Now, what's important is you don't go a step further and then have George Bush be the patron of your movement or Nancy Pelosi be the patron. One of our core beliefs is the Vietnam problem has to be solved by the Vietnamese. Okay? You can never have an international solution for Vietnam. And once you start pining for an international solution, your movement is lost. Okay? Vietnam, the Paris Peace Agreement was a very sad story, because that was when outside powers decided the future of Vietnam. I mean, to us, that can never happen again. It has to be the Vietnamese people. So the fact that, we have a diaspora movement means that we are able to leverage our political contacts out here. But it's important to realize in the big picture that it's the people inside Vietnam that has to change the country. It's not going to be the outside support. So any diaspora movement, in my view, that starts seeking out patrons or giving people the status of a patron, it is doomed to fail. You're going to lose credibility within the country, and you're not true to what you're trying to achieve. So I don't think any movement should have a patron. You should have allies, and luckily we have some very good allies, so we don't think of them as patrons. So after we've looked at the Bush-Pelosi picture, the question is, how, as a U.S. policymaker, how would you perceive a diaspora group? Because diaspora groups want to do international advocacy, mobilize international support, blah blah blah. But how do policymakers, particularly the U.S., think of diaspora groups?
Voters.
Huh?
Voters.
Okay. Yeah.
It depends on the group and what their objective is and how they go about trying to achieve it.
Mm-hmm.
Some groups, it sounds like you guys are relatively benign in terms of getting me in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
So I would be a little more open to you than I would be if, say there was a group that was supportive of a violent movement that would get the United States into problems.
Yeah.
And it depends on the country too. If it's a diaspora group out of, one of our strongest allies trying to overthrow them, might not be so keen. Or if it's somebody out of the country that, we wouldn't mind seeing some change, then.
Yeah. But sometimes what you said and what you said is the same thing. In the case of the Irish Republican Army, who was, a thorn in the side of the Brits, but they had a lot of support from Irish Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me that the Vietnamese government has listed Viet Thanh as a terrorist organization, and the United States has obviously plays a big role in the global war on terror. Whatever. So how do policymakers, the President of the United States, reconcile meeting with Viet Thanh but also being a leader in the global war on terror?
Yeah. Well, this picture was taken in May and June of 2007. And really at the beginning of 2007, the Vietnamese government started this propaganda attack on us, calling us a terrorist group. And a couple months later, these pictures came. So this was actually, in terms of our own PR quite important to to basically challenge those claims. So you're right. A lot of times U.S. policymakers, well, at least congressional ones, think of diaspora groups as voters, and it so happens that in communities, maybe it's a coincidence, but in communities where there's a lot of Vietnamese American voters, those members of Congress are very active on human rights. San Jose, California, Orange County, Houston, Atlanta, those are very pro-human rights members of Congress. And so when Hillary Clinton went to Vietnam this summer for the ASEAN Regional Forum, 20 members of Congress wrote her a letter, reminded her to talk about human rights, and she did in the very first day she brought up human rights. So being a voting bloc is important. And Vietnamese Americans are now about 1.5 million in the U.S. And some congressional districts were a couple of percentage points. So that's, you have to register the radar screen. Now, policymakers also sometimes see diaspora groups as these a word of these shadowy groups. Who are these groups that we're meeting with? So it's important for that group to establish some credibility and to be able to break through propaganda that the regime may be saying against them. And then, another question of policymakers is this diaspora group representative of people inside the country? Am I just talking to this one guy who lives, in Washington, D.C., who likes to do this? I mean, what kind of contact does he have in Vietnam? Or is this group just a bunch of Iranians in Los Angeles? What does that have to do with Iran? So it's important for a diaspora group to let the U.S. policymakers see that they are somehow connected with the movement on the ground, and that maybe they can be a source of change. Yeah.
What was that like when you mentioned human rights? Like, was that a strategic move to try to rally people around that topic, or is there just something within Vietnamese culture that's, I don't know, more predisposed towards human rights? I don't know, as an issue.
As opposed to what other issue?
Democracy, for example.
Oh. No, our advocacy. That's a really good distinction between human rights and democracy. Obviously, we want to generate democratic pressures. Sometimes it's easier for politicians to just talk about human rights because human rights doesn't necessarily imply a regime change. It's not meant to be necessarily confrontational with the government. It's just, why are you arresting this person because of a blog or because of their faith? Let this monk or this Catholic priest go. And it's easier when you do, obviously, with parliamentarians to talk about human rights than democracy, because that's very, very political. It's a step further. But we recognize that there's need for political change. So we try to make the case that why democratic change in Vietnam is in the interest of international players. Yeah.
But also that depends on the focus of the Vietnam and the strategic view of the United States or the interest of the United States. This is why the United States speaks out more on Iran or China because it has interest.
Yeah.
But Vietnam, according to the U.S., is not.
You're right. Yeah, I think from the standpoint of U.S. policymakers, if Iran would become democratic, a lot of the problems would go away. There's no parallel in Vietnam, so that's why it's human rights. Now, if the movement, and I've been told this by a mid-level person in the State Department, that if right now the U.S. doesn't seek regime change in Vietnam, but if you have protests that get larger, let's say you had in Burma, then the U.S. position may change. Because they're not fans of the current system, but they just have to work with it. Yeah.
I guess what I was getting at was the human rights issue used as a way to organize the diaspora? That's what I was. Like, was it a compromise issue?
No. The diaspora is all for regime change.
Okay.
Yeah. Of the diaspora who are interested in politics, they all want to see democratic change in Vietnam and the end of the communist system. So when I talk about members of Congress writing letters on human rights, it's just an issue that they can agree on, that they bring up.
So that's the editing on the congressional side. So if they receive an angry letter from the diaspora, it's including all of it, and then Congress is moderating it?
No. Well, for instance, most diaspora groups want political change in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. All the political groups, by definition, want political change in Vietnam. But technically, they may have a member of Congress write a letter on a human rights abuse, rather than have a member of Congress write a letter to the Vietnamese government saying, how come you don't allow free elections? Because that may be too far for members of Congress.
Do you ever worry about getting used by U.S. officials for America's own strategic interests? Like, say, the U.S. policymakers might say, well, we're going to continue to meet with this this human rights group until, for example, you reduce tariffs on automobiles or something like that.
Yeah, I think I think that's something that every diaspora group has to be aware of, and it just comes back to remembering what your belief is in terms of what takes the priority. Is it the international support, or is it the strength of the movement on the ground? What you really believe in, and you really have to believe in sort of your inner strength and being true to the interests of your movement as opposed to an outside power, whether it be the U.S. or somebody else. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to dominate,
No, that's fine.
but isn't that the goal though, to use another country's interest to promote your own? I mean, I guess I'm confused as to why that would be.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that good? Isn't that good strategy?
It's good. I mean, obviously, technically, you want to, for instance, align your interests. I mean, I want to see human rights in Vietnam, and I'm constantly trying to explain to say, members of Congress why human rights in Vietnam is so important to U.S. economic security interests. So to align interests. But what you don't want going further is for instance, a policymaker using a diaspora group to do things that may be not in the interest of that country, just because of advancing the U.S. interests. Maybe that may apply to other countries more readily. Yeah. Okay. Yes?
We talked at some length about the government support. What about the private sector? If you look at Vietnam, private capital flows have been increasing steadily over the years.
Yeah.
My question is, that in many countries, private capital flows have led to liberalization, democratic reform, and others. To what extent are you working with, some of those groups which are investing very heavily, both from Europe, from the Bata Company of Britain, all the way to Coca-Cola right here?
Yeah.
How is this dynamic being played, and what role are you playing with these private capital flows, if any?
Well, I'm not so sure private capital flows have led to democratic changes. Maybe sometimes the two have happened at the same time, but not necessarily a cause and effect. Yeah, I mean, I think the business community is a stakeholder. Usually business community is a follower. They're not going to be sticking their neck out for people's rights. And I say this as someone who's very pro-business. I went to the University of Chicago. But the business community is not going to be sticking their necks out. They'll be a follower. And what we can do is highlight the political risk in Vietnam when the government arrests a dissident. So, business community wants to invest in the Vietnamese IT sector. We talk about internet restrictions and how you can't have a knowledge-based economy when you have internet censorship. There's going to be the donor meetings in Vietnam next month, organized by the World Bank. One of the big issues that we're pushing right now is rule by law, meaning how the Vietnamese government uses law to rule the people. And we're going to talk about how, the donor community talks about governance and rule of law, but if the Vietnamese government can use various provisions of the legal code to arrest dissidents, then you don't have rule of law or good governance. So we do our best to link some of these issues, but when it comes to business community, I don't see the business community going on the forefront. Now, with the exception of one company, who I think is doing a good job, is Google. And I think on internet front, Google has been an ally of a lot of groups. Okay. All right, so moving along, just a sort of a quick case study on an issue I think that's important is digital resistance or digital activism. And one of the things that we're doing and diaspora groups in general can do is using the internet to affect change. And one of the big issues in Vietnam is the environment. The government has initiated bauxite mining and has a lot of environmental hazards, and it's getting a lot of people involved. And I have a video to give you some background. A little time. Yeah, it's only like 2 minutes.
This is the site that's united in opposition ordinary Vietnamese with academics, political exiles, and even famed Vietnam War hero General Giap. It's bauxite, the raw material for producing aluminium, and this is the first ever video footage of the controversial mine site.
Before, our Vietnamese people, they trust the party, they trust their leaders. But now they have the awareness rising a lot. And that's why this time we have the first civil movement to protest against the bauxite project since 1945.
Al Jazeera won't reveal this man's identity for his own security, but he's one of a group of academics who set up the website Bauxite Vietnam to protest the mine project. It's received more than 16 million hits since April, and more than 2,500 people have signed a petition asking the government to halt the project. Vietnam sits on the world's third largest reserves of bauxite, and the $460 million project is a joint venture with a Chinese firm. Vietnam, the organisation behind the plan, claims it will earn the country up to $200 million a year. But critics say the figures just don't add up.
Economically speaking, there's no promise about we can get any profit from the selling of the alumina, because the price in the world market is low.
But the real fear is the project could jeopardise the entire economic, environmental and social structure of the Central Highlands. The area produces 80% of Vietnam's coffee, as well as tea, rubber and cocoa. It's home too to thousands of minority highland villagers who face being uprooted from their homes and livelihoods. But the major concern is how the toxic slurry produced when bauxite is processed will be stored. Duy Hoang is from an unsanctioned pro-democracy party active in Vietnam.
The biggest problem of mining bauxite is the environmental hazards, because to develop, say, a ton of alumina or aluminum, you essentially give off 4 tons of caustic sludge.
There are plans to keep the so-called red mud in a nearby lake, but if the mud leaches into the water table, the effects could be catastrophic.
The red sludge can get into the drinking water and harm basically millions of people. And then there's the dust from the sludge can be inhaled, and that creates a pollutant. So that is a significant worry.
International donors have called on Vietnam to be cautious in its handling of the bauxite project. The former Norwegian ambassador, Kjell Stolokken, warning Hanoi to make every effort to limit the environmental cost of mining and minimise the impact on natural surroundings. The Vietnamese government says it wants to develop an impoverished region for the benefit of local people, and it's pledged to impose strict controls over the project. It says it will not pursue bauxite at any cost. But getting it wrong could come at a very high price. Al Jazeera, Vietnam.
So this is an example of an issue that has really gotten a lot of interest in Vietnam across the whole political spectrum, uniting people, and a lot of it has been organized on the web and with the involvement of our organization and the larger diaspora. So for Earth Day, we organized a campaign called Safe They Win, which is Vietnamese for the Central Highlands. Right. In 2007, there were beginning of steep protests in Vietnam on the China issue, and people used the web to organize the protests. And this had never been done before. This is the map of the protests. And these were hundreds of Vietnamese students and youth protesting outside the Chinese embassy and consulate for 2 weekends in December of 2007. And this was using the web. Now, after the government cracked down on these protests, people moved offline to online. So this is a T-shirt that was designed. Basically, it says, keep the Central Highlands green, protect Vietnam's security. This is an SOS sign because of the bauxite mining. And so when this movement got cracked down, people moved on the web, and everyone changed their avatar to the symbol when the activists were arrested. And a lot of this work is coordinated by the diaspora. Okay, and we see that the internet is a really important tool for organizing, for digital activism, because there are 25 million people using internet in Vietnam. So we've been active on the Hill and other forums to talk about internet freedom. And when the Vietnamese government ordered ISPs to block Facebook last year, we tried to get the message out on advocacy level, but also within Vietnam to get people to circumvent. And this is a video that we produced, and it got about 100,000 views. So, kind of went viral, and most of the views happened from people inside of Vietnam. So.
Tin mới, Cộng sản Việt Nam vừa ngăn chặn Facebook tại Việt Nam.
I'm bringing Facebook back. Yeah. Them bid officials don't know how to act. Yeah. I think it's foolish how they attack. Yeah. So turn on the switch and then put it back. Yeah. Take it to the site. Don't worry, babe. I will connect you in other ways.
Yeah. So the video ends with 3 action items. Spread the video, and 100,000 people have seen it. Share the blog, and that blog is the Facebook backed blog. It gives really clear instructions how to circumvent the Facebook block. And third is demand your ISP to give you access to Facebook, because the Vietnamese government didn't block Facebook outright. They ordered ISPs to do it. And nobody in Vietnam does this advocacy work, but we wanted to get people used to calling their ISPs to do it. And we wanted to do a video that wouldn't challenge the government. So it wasn't like complaining to the government, which is unrealistic in Vietnam. It was complaining with your ISP. And happily, since the Vietnamese government blocked Facebook a year ago, more people are online now because they've found ways to circumvent.
The people they use a proxy to enter the Facebook.
They changed their DNS. They use proxies. They use various ways.
It's a touchscreen on the front. There's a
okay. Yeah, the way the Vietnamese government blocked it wasn't too sophisticated, so people are still going in.
Yeah,
So
when we were in Vietnam, summer we were with other people and you Google it, how do I get Facebook in Vietnam?
Yeah.
There's many sites that show you how to do it. It takes 2 minutes.
I think it was a monumental mistake for them to do this, because they basically sent a dilemma action for them. Is if they really go through with the block, they essentially piss off about 1.5 million people. That was 1.5 million people who are the youngest, the most educated, the most affluent, the children, the grandchildren of the Central Committee in Vietnam. So they actually go through with the block. But if they don't, then they kind of encourage civil disobedience and let people see that it's okay to defy the government orders. And before Facebook, the people who go into the Viet Dinh website, frankly, are just a segment of the dissidents in Vietnam. Not everyone goes to the Viet Dinh website or other proto-monks websites, but people who use Facebook as a cross-section of the country. And so they politicize their censorship. And when Hillary went to Vietnam, she brought that up. Okay, so to conclude, a few thoughts is, what makes a diaspora movement effective? And I think one is the cohesiveness. Diasporas that are very split, have a lot of factions, obviously will be less effective. And the thing is, I think by nature, all diaspora groups think the grass is greener on the other side. They always think of their group as hopelessly divided and has all these problems. I think the other groups are mythically united and have all this influence, but I think a lot of the groups have the same issues. But it comes down to cohesiveness. I think the Vietnamese diaspora, although is very factionalized, had a lot of issues, but politically it's all very homogeneous. It's mainly the woke people, and that has been something that's kept it together. Whereas if you look, for instance, the Chinese diaspora, it's come about through many generations, and people from the mainland, from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, so some things that divide them. Whereas the Vietnamese diaspora, fortunately, is cohesive. The economic, political might of the diaspora, I mean, if your diaspora has a lot of money vis-a-vis the regime, you have more your clout, right? And if your diaspora can sway the votes in Florida for a president, then you're going to have influence as well. The perceptions of a homeland toward the outside world. If the homeland is very pro-engagement, wants good relationships with the Western world where the diaspora lives, then they're going to, I think, have a good view of the diaspora. If it's very xenophobic and doesn't like the outside world, then they'll probably associate the diaspora as being, bad, just like the outside world. The level of interaction. I think the Korean diaspora is pretty irrelevant in North Korea. But in other places where there's interaction, I think the diaspora has leverage. But taken to extreme, if the country is very open, sometimes the diaspora can be very, very easily co-opted because they want to maintain their access to the country. They have businesses in the country. They have family members that they have to visit. So it's hard for them to be involved. And that's a challenge for the Vietnamese community now, because it used to be, for instance, an academic question whether you go back to Vietnam or not. Now that it's easy to go back to Vietnam, everybody has a relative in Vietnam. Vietnamese students who have social consciences, but they want to have internships in Vietnam. So how oppositional are you going to be when you need to travel to the country? So if a country is completely shut off, diaspora is irrelevant. If it's completely open, diaspora can be co-opted because they want to be in the country. The ability to negate the regime's propaganda. By definition, diasporas are always, traitors, people who betray the country to the regime. Diaspora is always, groups in diaspora are always going to be viewed as subversives. In our case, terrorist groups. And in Vietnamese state media, when they talk about our organization, they don't say Viet Tân or the group Viet Tân. It's always the terrorist group Viet Tân. That's how they branded us. So if you can't negate that propaganda, then you have a serious problem. So in our situation, one of our challenges is to get a message across inside Vietnam. And back to, I think, what you had asked, or maybe you had it, is the relevance over time. Because, after a time, that diaspora becomes more assimilated. The Vietnamese become Vietnamese Americans, and they become Americans of Vietnamese descent, then they don't speak the language anymore. And if your diaspora becomes very, very assimilated, then, it may not be as tied to the country. But then we've seen cases where some diasporas, after 2,000 years are still very tied to their homeland, right? Or some diasporas like, Polish Americans, Irish Americans, many, many generations. But, they're not opposed, well, for instance, the Irish Americans are opposed to the government, but they're sources of support for their government. So, maybe diasporas can still be attached to their homeland after some time. But that really depends. And another thing is, a lot of times diaspora is always stuck in history because they have a pivotal moment in history that created that diaspora. 1959 Cuba, 1975 Vietnam. And will that diaspora just be stuck in time? Will they always think of themselves as people who lived in Vietnam in 1975 and they're able to move beyond that? And in the Vietnamese community, frankly, a lot of diaspora groups are stuck in the past. They want to return to the past, and that's made them very ineffective. So how relevant is that diaspora group to how the country has evolved? Every country changes in 20, 30 years. Iran has changed a lot in the last 30 years. The diaspora that formed in LA in 1980, they won't recognize Iran anymore, and they have to be able to update their views. And then on being a diaspora movement, I think it's important to avoid the perception or the reality of being an entirely diaspora movement. If you're an exile group, that is, I think, a baggage that you want to avoid. It's okay to have support outside, but you have to have some kind of internal presence or legitimacy as well. You want to avoid the perception of the reality of being dependent on foreign help. It's a positive thing to be able to mobilize international support, to have a say with foreign leaders. But when you become dependent on them, then that's a negative thing. That can be the curse of death, I think, for a lot of diaspora movements. So because of that, you want to harness the best of diaspora and local movements. Obviously, each one has its strengths and its weaknesses. And if you can combine the two, then you're going to have a very strong movement. Okay. And ideally, if your roots are in the diaspora movement, how do you transition to being a local political force? In the case of Viet Thanh, our strategy is to become a open political movement on the ground in Vietnam, despite government repression. And when we're organizing civic actions in Vietnam, it's part of an evolution to where we operate openly in Vietnam, despite what the government says or thinks. And I think that's a challenge for diaspora groups. Okay. So that's all I have. This is a cartoon designed by a Vietnamese blogger, and it basically says, that kid, that punk, has posted my picture online. And I think that's something that diasporas are really good at doing. So thank you for your attention.